that's what I'm going to talk to you about this evening. I'm going to briefly, first of all, mention the BBSRC Sustainable Bioenergy Centre, which is a large virtual centre in the UK that my work is done within the context of. And then towards the end I'll talk in a little bit more detail about my own work and what we're doing here in Dundee. So basically, I can't remember what stage I wanted to show you these, but basically when we're making fuels from crops, we're making it mainly from the grain. And the reason that we're making it from the grain is that the grain is a really good source of sugar. So in something like a barley grain, the sugar is locked up in starch in the grain, but it's fairly easily accessible and easy to get to. It's also the same in food, in sources such as sugar cane, where you can just squash out the soluble sugars and use that as a substrate for making fuel from. And that's what these first generation fuels are from. By contrast, if you want to make fuel out of the biomass of the plant, the bits that are not the grain, not sugary, you have a much bigger problem. So how this is done is that, first of all, of course, you have to source your biomass. So that could be agricultural waste, as in the case of the work we're doing in Dundee. But it could also be dedicated bioenergy crops. It could be crops like miscanthus and willow that you might be able to grow on poorer land that you wouldn't really be able to grow a premium crop on. And within this BBSRC Sustainable Bioenergy Centre, which is a virtual centre of 6 research hubs throughout the UK, we're looking at both of these different types of feedstocks and trying to work out how they could best or potentially be used and improved for second generation or advanced generation biofuels, sometimes also known as cellulosic biofuels or lignocellulosic biofuels, because the source of the sugars is the cellulose in these parts of the biomass of the crop. So within that centre, there's people like me and people in Aberystwyth and in Rothamsted who are working on the raw materials. There's people who are working on the enzymes. So what you have to do to make a second generation biofuel is chop up your biomass, and then, because it's actually really difficult to get at the sugars in these biomass crops because they're not easily available as they are in the grain, what you have to do is use chemicals and a high temperature and pressure to try and explode the material apart a little bit. And then you can add enzymes that are able to begin to digest out the sugars. Then those sugars are fed to yeasts or microbes that are able to convert the sugars into fuel. And at the moment, second generation biofuels are not really very commercially viable. There are a few places in the world where they're being produced, but they're not really commercially viable. They can't really compete against first generation biofuels because of the costs involved in, first of all, this pre-treatment where you have to treat the material to try and get at the sugars, the cost of the expensive enzymes that you have to add in order to be able to digest the sugars, and then the inefficiency with which the yeasts and the microbes use the sugars. So within this BBSRC centre, we have people working on all these different aspects of the problem. And there's also people who are looking at the whole sustainability of the process, doing whole life cycle analysis, and even going out and surveying farmers to try and find out how much straw, for example, they would be willing to supply to a second generation bioenergy industry if we had one, or whether they would be willing to set aside a small amount of land, whether they have land that's not suitable for crops but which they would grow miscanthus or willow on. So that's what this big BBSRC Sustainable Bioenergy Centre is doing.